All right, so this week, U.S. Embassy officials met with detained basketball star Brittney Griner. Let's talk about the details. My name is Jamahl Kersey. I am the principal attorney at Kersey Law, a boutique criminal defense firm in San Diego, California. And in this video, we're talking about Brittney Griner. This case obviously started earlier this year. I've been wanting to speak on it, but just didn't get a chance to. And so now taking advantage of the headline of U.S. Embassy officials meeting with Griner, I wanted to speak on the situation. And so get you up to speed. In February of this year, Brittney Griner was arrested at the Sheremetyevo airport in Moscow after customs officials said that they found vape canisters containing cannabis oil in her luggage. And so she had been arrested, taken into custody, and there was a big outcry because she had been detained so long. And so obviously she's still there today. But in May, her lawyers had made a request for house arrest, and I imagine there was probably some sort of pitch for bail as well in terms of her being released. And so obviously she is in Russia, going through the Russian criminal justice system and not here in the United States. But, if she were, a request for release on bond would not at all be an unreasonable request. In fact, that'd be an absolutely reasonable request. And so when a judge is considering bond, there are two primary things that the judge is looking at. And number one is going to be whether you're going to be a danger to the community. So that tends to be a big factor when we're talking about violent crimes, right? So if a person is being charged with a serious violent offense, whether that's an assault with a deadly weapon, a serious burglary or a robbery, or if they have a string of domestic violence offenses in their criminal history, anything that raises concerns with the district attorney and the judge that a person is, if they get released, that the public, any witnesses or the alleged victim in the case would be at risk. So that's going to be number one. And then number two is going to be whether you'll be a flight risk. And so as far as I know, Brittney Griner had no criminal history whatsoever, right? So there wasn't any sort of danger to the Russian community if she were to get out that she was going to commit further offenses or anything like that. And, she's a professional basketball player. She's making what sounds like the equivalent of $1.5 million a year in Russia and another six figures here in the States. In terms of any flight risk, she's obviously not a Russian citizen, but she does have ties to Russia. I mean, she plays for a team there, right? And so if nothing else, they could take her passport and ensure that she would remain in Russia throughout the process. I imagine she probably has some sort of temporary residence that she rents there. So there wouldn't be any risk of her not showing up to court in her future court dates. But again, we're not dealing with the laws of the United States or, any of its respective individual states. And that becomes a major issue, as you can see later on, and we'll discuss that a little later. But nonetheless, she went through the whole criminal court process in Russia, including a trial. And, I'm certainly not I can't even say well-versed. I'm not versed at all in Russian law or their criminal procedure, but whatever their equivalent of a trial is, she went through that and had asserted what her defenses were. She eventually entered a guilty plea, but she did indicate that she had been prescribed a medical cannabis to treat pain. She's obviously an athlete, a professional athlete. She had some knee issues. And so she had this recommendation to use medical cannabis. But nonetheless, she was not, as far as I understand, she was not intentionally carrying these vape cartridges on her person. It sounds like it was a mistake. And she was ultimately found guilty of attempting to smuggle illegal narcotics into the country, and she was ultimately sentenced to 9 years in prison. 9 years in prison. She filed an appeal, and just last month the appeal was denied, meaning that the prison term would be upheld. And so that is an extremely quick process. Here in the United States, an appeal process would not be that quick, but But here it was. U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price had tweeted, "We continue to press for the immediate release of Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan and fair treatment for every detained American." And so if you weren't aware of who Paul Whelan is, he is a U.S. citizen. He's a former Marine, and back in 2018, he was detained in a Moscow hotel and accused of spying. And as a result, he was sentenced to a 16-year prison sentence. The White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre had stated that the U.S. government made a significant offer to the Russians to resolve the current unacceptable and wrongful detentions of American citizens. And despite a lack of good faith negotiations by the Russians, the U.S. government has continued to follow up on that offer and propose alternative potential ways forward with the Russians through all available channels. And she indicates securing Griner's release as a top priority. Now, what that ultimately means, who knows, but at least they're giving the impression that they take this matter obviously seriously, and they're doing everything that they can to right this situation. Ms. Pierre also had indicated that Griner appears to be doing as well as possibly expected given the circumstances, which, really isn't saying much at all. I mean, people say that being detained in jails in the United States are horrible. You probably remember Young Thug's lawyer making the pitch for him to get out of custody, is basically saying that the conditions were inhumane in the detention facility. And so I just imagine that a jail in the United States would probably be an amusement park compared to being in a Russian jail. And so, unfortunately, she is still detained. There's been no indication that she's going to be released anytime soon. And realistically, I mean, she just had some really bad timing in this whole situation. Just about a week after she was arrested, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so both Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan, they find themselves basically as pieces in the middle of these really complex diplomatic negotiations while you have a Russian invasion of Ukraine in the background, and this just makes an already difficult situation seem impossible. And, I'm certainly not going to hold myself out as being knowledgeable on how these diplomatic negotiations work, but I just know that in terms of these two individuals being released, it is making it really difficult to make this happen. But in the background, while we have this going on out in Russia, we had President Joe Biden announce last month that he was going to pardon people who had been federally convicted of simple possession of marijuana. Now, this on some level is a really big deal because of how conservatively the federal government has continued to view marijuana, and just how seemingly behind the times the feds have been. And so the proposed pardon is stated to positively affect more than 6,500 people, but some people have been looking at this situation as not that big of a victory. And the reason being is because simple possession, so to be clear, we're only talking about simple possession of marijuana versus possession of marijuana for sale or transportation of marijuana or anything in the realm of drug trafficking. We're just talking about simple possession. And simple possession of marijuana is almost never prosecuted at the federal level. Drug offenses, especially, simple possession, are generally prosecuted at the state level. So, this proposal doesn't affect state offenses at all. The president just wouldn't have the power to do that. But the hope is that the individual states will eventually follow suit. And, we're really hoping that that really happens. And, change has just been extremely slow, but progress has been made over the years. And according to the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, 37 states and the District of Columbia, so Washington, D.C., they all have laws permitting marijuana for medical use. There are 12 states that permit limited access to products with low THC And there are 19 states, along with DC, that have approved adult possession and consumption of marijuana. Also, according to NORML, 27 states have partially or fully decriminalized some offenses for marijuana possession. I'm mentioning this because we're seeing a shift in the United States, as we've seen in the past few years, shifts towards the decriminalization of marijuana. And so when we talk about this particular situation with Brittney Griner, she had 2 cartridges that had 0.252 grams and 0.45 grams of hash oil, totaling 0.702 grams. So basically, we know, again, she was sentenced to 9 years in prison for less than a gram of hash oil. Hash oil or any cannabis content product is in fact illegal in Russia. And so apparently if a person is in possession of a substance that has less than 6 grams of cannabis or 2 grams of hash, then the possessor can face imprisonment of up to 15 days. So 15 days in custody and a fine if they're proven guilty. Now, if we just compare that to where we're at in California, so California is where I practice law. I mean, this is insanely harsh because, here it's legal. It is absolutely legal for an adult to possess and consume marijuana recreationally. And like I said, there are many other states here that are headed in that direction. But unfortunately, again, Brittney Griner was not in the United States. She is in Russia, and their laws are insanely different, as you can see. And the other part of it is, I just mentioned that under Russian law, that simple possession, you can do up to 15 days in jail and a fine. But the issue is that she wasn't charged with just simple possession. She was actually charged with drug smuggling. And so this particular charge would carry a sentence of up to 3 to 10 years in prison. So there's a guideline range, and it would range from 3 to 10 years in prison. Now, as I mentioned before, Brittney, she ultimately made the decision to plead guilty. Apparently, the hope from her legal team was that in admitting guilt, the court would be lenient with sentencing. And, that can be common here in the United States as well. Again, I think their procedure is a little different, but here in the United States, if you go to trial and you're ultimately found guilty, generally speaking, the sentence that you're going to be subjected to is going to be a lot more harsh than if you admit guilt and avoid trial. You can sometimes shave years off of a prison sentence by pleading guilty, or might just be sentenced to probation versus having to go into custody. There's all kinds of different things that could potentially be negotiated. But yes, if you do take your case to trial and you're found guilty, then a lot of times the sentence is just going to be more harsh. So again, she had already been in trial, but, apparently in their procedure, she was still able to basically plead guilty. Throughout these court proceedings, again, Griner had confirmed that she had a doctor's prescription for the use of medical cannabis. Again, obviously an American doctor, not a Russian one. But she had this knee injury. So she was in a wheelchair for months. She testified to the court and said that basically she was using this substance for her inflamed knee and ankle joint. She also made a point to emphasize that she wasn't using it before, basketball games and tournaments in order to avoid possible disqualifications. But in terms of what ultimately happened factually, is she mentioned that she packed her bag in a hurry. And it was an honest mistake. She said she did not think of or have a plan to bring banned substances into Russia. She said, hey, I'm aware of Russian laws. I know and respect the Russian laws, and I never had any intent whatsoever to break them. And, honestly, it is a reasonable mistake if you think about it. I mean, it's not like she had just, 20 big Ziploc bags full of weed in her luggage. Like, she had these little vape cartridges. It was 2 of them. Again, less than a gram of hash oil. I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly been running late in packing my luggage, the day of a flight. And, if I don't personally smoke weed or, smoke hash oil or anything like that. But I mean, I could see if I had these little vape cartridges how it would be very easy to, have that slipped into one of my bags or something. I mean, if we really do accept as true her position, it just doesn't sound unreasonable. Again, if we're talking about big bricks of marijuana or huge bags packed in her bag, then I can see how that becomes an unreasonable position. But something that small, something that you have a, medical clearance for or a medical recommendation for, you're typically moving around with it and it's not illegal in the States, it's easy to understand how you might forget to take it out of the bag or even not know that it was there. She made her plea for leniency, obviously through her lawyers. And unfortunately, there just was no leniency whatsoever because she was ultimately sentenced to 9 years in prison, and she was hit with a fine that would be the equivalent of around $60,000. And so, just to me, this sentence is insanely excessive and it's unfair. I mean, realistically, we're not talking about cocaine or heroin or meth, but I mean, even if we were, I'd still think that this sentence were excessive. But, that's a conversation for another day. Again, in this context, if we're talking about simple possession, because just the small amount, I don't think there's any suspicion that she's some sort of drug dealer or anything like that. It just seems unreasonably harsh. On the day Brittney Griner had been sentenced, Vice President Kamala Harris had tweeted, "With today's sentencing, Russia continues its wrongful detention of Brittney Griner. She should be released immediately. The President of the United States and I and our entire administration are working every day to reunite Brittney as well as Paul Whelan with the loved ones who miss each of them dearly." And so, there have been people who have taken the position of, why would you bring vape cartridges to a foreign country, especially one like Russia? And that's a fair question. And I completely agree. When you leave the United States or when you leave wherever you're from, you just absolutely should be aware of foreign laws. But the problem with that criticism is that she acknowledged that she is aware of Russian laws, but she made a mistake. She put these things in her bag at some point and didn't realize they were in her bag. And when she went through customs, that's when the cartridges were discovered. She had no intent whatsoever to bring these cartridges with her. And so intent, at least again, here in the United States, your intentions matter. The context of a situation matters. Your criminal history or lack thereof matters. I mean, just this last year, I had represented a gentleman who basically had something in his bag that, he shouldn't have had in his bag. And he was going through a security checkpoint and the items were ultimately discovered and confiscated and he was arrested and facing criminal charges. And I've talked about in other videos, there's usually a time between when a person gets arrested and the date that's set for court. And sometimes it can just be a few days. Sometimes it's a few weeks. And we take advantage of that time and did so in this case to gather all kinds of positive information about him to be able to tell his story. Because like I generally say, listen, the district attorney does not know anything about the people that they're going to prosecute. Really, they get a file and that file is going to have the police report and, any videos, photographs, other evidence that comes from the police, but there's no information whatsoever about that person. And so it's really important for us to fill in the holes in terms of saying, he has gainful employment, including letters of support, all kinds of people, whether that's, mother, brother, sister, best friend, wife, children, all kinds of people who can really attest to this person's character. I've known this person for 10 years. He's a stand-up guy. He's my best friend. He'd give you the shirt off his back. He's super, he'll always be there for you in a jam. All these different type of things that are going to absolutely help a prosecutor understand who it is that they're dealing with. And ultimately, based on his, the proof of his employment, he had a really good job, his schooling, we were able to demonstrate that this, it was just an honest mistake. He didn't do it on purpose. And so ultimately the prosecutors had exercised their discretion and they declined to file charges. There's, I hear all these just really uninformed, ignorant opinions on how prosecution should be carried out. And again, that's generally, we're talking about U.S. laws, but I think a similar position could be taken on what's going on here because, there should be discretion by prosecutors. And again, I'm not aware of, if there is in Russia, there may not be, but if there's not, there should be, because just because there are elements fulfilled and that you could argue that a violation of the law has taken place doesn't mean that person should necessarily be prosecuted, doesn't mean that that person should necessarily be incarcerated and sentenced to jail or prison. And I am thankful that our laws here in the United States are reflective of that. There's a reason why we don't just have like a judge, a DA, and defense algorithms or computers where you just input information and then it just automatically calculates a result. No, why? Because there's a human element. There's a human element, and there is a desire to pursue justice. And I just think that there is no justice whatsoever in a situation where a person made a simple mistake, an honest mistake, a mistake that anybody could possibly make, and end up having to do 9 years in prison on this. This is a very unfair situation. It doesn't appear that, within the Russian criminal justice system, there's going to be anything to be able to resolve the situation. It's probably going to take something, based on the negotiations between the U.S. government and the Russian government to get this thing done. But, I'm hopeful that they can get something done, and soon. And, just to the lack of empathetic people in this situation, I would just say, if it was your daughter, if it was your son, I just can't imagine people taking this stance. And I know that to be true. All the people who are really hardcore, throw the book at them, tough on crime people, it's interesting that when it's them or someone they love that's in a jam, somehow they really change their tune. And that's when they're looking for mercy. That's when they're looking for grace. That's when they're looking for their loved one's story to be told so that there's context and that the DA and the judge can appreciate the backdrop of things in order to not go so aggressively on their loved ones. I think empathy is absolutely necessary in this situation. And just in general, I think we all could use more empathy. But suffice it to say that, again, I think this sentence is unduly harsh. I think it's, way more than is appropriate given the situation. And I absolutely, hope that for Brittney's sake, for her family, her wife, her loved ones, friends, her teammates, that, this situation gets resolved soon and she's able to be released from custody. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I will get to them, and ideally I'll be able to respond. But I definitely appreciate you watching. If you got something out of this, please show me some love and hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you never miss a new video when it drops. And as always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.